Hello, welcome to your next memory lesson. Today we're going to be looking at explanations for forgetting, and we're going to be starting with interference. So as always, have your notes ready, your pen and your textbook. Just to quickly recap what we've already covered, we started with short-term and long-term memory, and we looked at how they're encoded, the capacity of them and the duration of them. Then we looked at the multi-store memory model. Then we looked at the working memory model. And the last thing that we did was the types of long-term memory. So now we're moving on to explanations for forgetting. And today we're going to be looking at proactive and retroactive interference. And then after this, we'll be looking at retrieval failure as another explanation of forgetting. I want to start by recapping what we looked at last lesson, which was the evaluation of types of long-term memory. So your task is to link the point, which is on the left, with the conclusion on the right. So in the middle, all I want you to write down is some evidence to support this point. And I want you to try and do it from memory. So I don't want you to use your notebooks or your textbooks. What I want you to do is try and write as much information as you remember from last lesson, and then go back in a different colour after you've checked your textbook or your notes. Fill in any gaps that you've forgotten. So pause me now and have a go at that. So the first evaluation point was about the brain scanning techniques that have identified that different kinds of long-term memory use different brain regions, which is support for Tulving's theory of long-term memory. So we looked at the three different types of long-term memory. Episodic memories use the hippocampus and the frontal lobe. Semantic memories, there's activity in the temporal lobe when we're accessing those. And for procedural memories, it's all to do with the cerebellum and the motor cortex. So well done if you remembered those brain regions. Our second evaluation point was about HM, and hopefully you watched the video and summarised the findings of HM's case study. So with HM, his ability to form new long-term memories was affected when they removed his hippocampus, but he did retain previous long-term memories. So it was all about this consolidation process. He wasn't able to form new ones, but he had his old ones. So with his after his operation, he could form procedural memories, but he couldn't form any episodic or semantic memories. So the way they did this was they did a mirror drawing task. So he had to draw the outline of a star by just looking in the mirror. And if you've ever tried to do this, it's a really, really difficult thing to do. And they found that even though HM had no recollection of doing this mirror drawing task, he did get better. So therefore he was forming new procedural memories, but he didn't have any episodic memory of that event happening in his life. And then the third evaluation that we looked at was about Alzheimer's patients and how there's this double dissociation. So all dissociation means is that there's a separation between two different abilities. So what researchers found is that some patients retain the ability to form semantic memories, but not episodic memories. So this is a single dissociation. It's a separation between two abilities. One ability being able to form semantic memories, one of the other being able to form episodic memories. And then other researchers found a double dissociation because some patients have the reverse. So some patients have poor semantic memories, but generally intact episodic memories. So the fact that we can't predict the difficulties that Alzheimer's patients will have is this double dissociation between abilities in forming new types of memories. It's again more evidence that different types of long-term memory exist and that they form separately. Okay, so why do we forget things? Is it because the information was never transferred to long-term memory? So when we looked at multi-store memory model, we saw that environmental stimuli enters our sensory register. If we pay attention to that environmental stimuli, it transfers over to short-term memory. Once in short-term memory, we do the process of maintenance rehearsal to keep it in short-term memory, or we do maintenance rehearsal to transfer it over to long-term memory. So it might be that things that entered our short-term memory we just didn't rehearse enough, so we didn't recall it, or we didn't tell anyone about it, or we didn't even think about it, so therefore it wasn't transferred to long-term memory. So that's one possibility of why we forget things. Another explanation is that memory just decays over time. So maybe it did transfer over to our long-term memory, but because we didn't use that information and we didn't retrieve that information back into our short-term memory, maybe it's just decayed and we've forgotten. Or the memory is in long-term memory, but you can't access it. And this is the explanation for forgetting that we'll look at next lesson, retrieval failure. Because sometimes we just need a cue in order to recall something. So you might not remember, for example, if I say, who did the famous study on obedience when we looked at social influence, you might not be able to remember the researcher's name, but then if I say it began with an M, then you might be like, oh yeah, Milgram. Or if you don't remember a certain event that happened in your life, being in the same place as where that event happened could trigger that memory. That's why sometimes if there's been like a murder case or something and there's been witnesses or victims, they'll take them back to, obviously not victims in a murder case, you know what I mean, in like a criminal case, they'll take them back to the place where the crime happened, and that acts as a cue, and then we're able to access that long-term memory. So just have a think about which of the above ideas you most agree with and why. And then after this lesson, you might change your opinion on that. So today we're looking at interference, and there's two types of interference: proactive and retroactive. And I'm going to show you a way to remember which one is which. So firstly, we have proactive interference, and this is when our past learning interferes with new learning. So what I do is I remember it by looking at the first two letters, PR, past learning interfering with recent learning. So for example, sometimes if someone asks me for my postcode, I tend to give them my old one. That's because my past learning is interfering with my new learning of my new postcode. And then we have retroactive interference, which is recent learning interfering with old learning. So again, with the R, recent interfering with old. So that would be, in the example of my postcode again, that would be if my recent postcode made me forget my old one, because recent learning has interfered with old learning for my old postcode. So have a go yourselves at reading the scenarios and identifying whether the people in the scenario are experiencing proactive or retroactive, not and. You can't experience both at the same time. So have a go and then we'll go through the answers. Joseph got a new mobile number and can finally remember it. After a few months, his mother asked him for his old number and he can no longer recall it. And this is probably something that we've all experienced. And this is retroactive interference because his recent learning for his new mobile number is preventing him from remembering old information of his old mobile number. Michelle learned Spanish at primary school. However, when she started secondary school, she learned French as well as Spanish. One day the French teacher asked her for the word hello, and she replied hola. This is proactive interference because her previous learning for Spanish is interfering with her new learning of French. And we're going to look at why this happens, especially when two things are quite similar, like Spanish and French. Forgetting will happen more because of the similarity of the materials. Ruth received her new credit card and memorised the PIN number 4159. However, when she's paying for shopping in Tesco, she uses her old credit card and can no longer remember the PIN. This again is retroactive interference. Recent learning of her new PIN is interfering with her old PIN. And David learned to drive a manual car, however, has recently purchased an automatic. When on holiday, David rents a car which is manual and keeps stalling the car because he forgets to press the clutch. This again is retroactive. Recent memory of driving an automatic is interfering with his old memory of driving a manual. Can you think of any real world examples of interference or things or cases of interference that have happened to you personally? It's really good if you can try and think of one of each, because then it'll be easy for you to recall what retroactive and proactive interference are in an exam. So think about interference that's personal to you. So maybe think about a hobby. So if you might be a dancer. Have you ever experienced when you've learned a new dance routine, so then you can't remember the old dance routine that you rehearsed maybe a few months ago? That would be retroactive because your recent memory for your new dance routine is interfering with your old dance routine. Or think about your favourite TV show, or just think about something that you've watched on telly recently. You might be able to remember all of the names of something that you've watched more recently, but then when you think back to a TV show that you watched maybe a few weeks back, you can't actually remember the characters' names anymore because that recent information for your new TV show is interfering with the old TV show. Proactive interference could be, this happens to me all the time, when your parents call you by your older sibling's name. That could be an example of proactive interference, because they're past learning, if your sibling was born first, they learnt their name first and then they forget yours, because the old information for your siblings' names is interfering with the new information of your name. So try and think of a few examples. We're going to look now at 4 pieces of research into interference. And the first one that we're going to look at, we're going to actually do as a little experiment. And it's very, very similar to what Underwood and Postman did to test interference. So in a second, I'm going to show you 2 word lists, and you're going to have 20 seconds to memorise them. No cheating, so don't write them down. Just look at them and try and memorise as many as you can. Your time starts now. Okay, now try and remember these. 20 seconds starting now. Okay, time's up. So pause me now and try and remember as many as you can from list B and as many as you can from list C. Take as long as you need, but no cheating. So these are the words that you should have remembered. Write down how many you remembered from list B and how many you remembered from list C. And then I want you to think which one caused more forgetting. So did you remember more from list B or did you remember more from list C? If you remembered more from list C, then you experienced retroactive interference because your recently learned information interfered with your old information for list B, so you didn't recall as many from list B. If you forgot more from list C, so you remembered more from list B, you experienced proactive interference because your previous information for list B, which you remembered quite well, interfered with your new learning of list C. And this is exactly what Underwood and Postman did in 1960. They wanted to test retroactive and proactive interference using word pairs. And so they gave them list A and list B together, and then list A and then list C together, and then they gave them list A and told them to write down as many as they could remember. They used a control group that only had to remember word lists A and B, so the control group weren't experiencing any sort of interference, no proactive or retroactive, and they found that the control group performed a lot better. They remembered a lot more of the words than those who had to recall both lists, demonstrating that retroactive interference and proactive interference affect our memories. The second piece of research I want to look at is about retroactive interference, and it was done by Muller and Pilzecker. And what they did is they gave participants a list of nonsense syllables. So they were made up words, they didn't mean anything, and they had to learn these for 6 minutes. They were given a retention interval, so like a small pause between learning the words and then having to recall them. However, some participants were given an intervening task. So one group of participants were given a task where they had to describe 3 landscape paintings. And what they found was that the performance was worse, so they remembered less of these nonsense syllables if the participants were given an intervening task between the initial learning and the recall. So write me a sentence to explain why this shows retroactive interference. It's because the new task of describing the paintings interfered with what had previously been learnt with the nonsense syllables. So recent information of describing the paintings interfered with old information of the nonsense syllables. The third piece of research is about proactive interference, and again it's by Underwood. So what Underwood did in this study is he analysed findings from a number of studies, and during the learning of a series of word lists, the ones learnt later on are less well remembered than the ones learnt earlier on. So if you look at the graph on the left, the more previous word lists that the participants had to remember, the smaller the percentage recall. So participants who had learnt more than 10 lists of words, after 24 hours only recalled about 20% of the words on those lists. However, participants who only learnt 1 list after 24 hours, they recalled 70% of all of those words. So how is this an example of proactive interference? Write me a little sentence. It's showing that each previously learnt word list interferes with the learning of subsequent word lists. So the more word lists that you have to learn, the more that previous information that we've learnt, so P for previous or past, interferes with our recent or our new memories. McGough and MacDonald looked at the similarity of test materials. So their aim was to investigate whether interference will be worse if items are similar or dissimilar. So all participants, first of all, were given a list of 10 adjectives, so describing words. Beautiful, big, lovely, yellow. Those are just off the top of my head. And then one group of participants, their list B was 10 synonyms. So 10 things that meant the same thing as those adjectives. So they were very similar in meaning, so semantically. A different group of participants was given list A, and then they were given a list of nonsense syllables. So again, words that didn't mean anything. And the third group, was given a list of numbers to remember. So they found that those who were given the synonyms only remembered about 12% of the words from list A. Those who were given nonsense syllables remembered about 26, and those who were given numbers remembered 37% of all of the adjectives. So what does this suggest about interference and similarity of test materials? Write me a little sentence to say what this research suggests. It suggests that interference is worse if the items are similar, based on the fact that the synonym group only remembered 12% compared to the numbers who remembered 37%. Last piece of research I want us to look at is Badley and Hitches research. And I want you to go to your textbook, the page on interference, and summarise their research into maximum of 25 words. And once you've done that, you can press play again and we'll go through the information together. So they basically wanted to investigate how many teams rugby players could recall from a rugby season that they had played. So some players had played more than others because some players had been injured, so they hadn't played against certain teams. So basically the time interval from start to the end of the season was the same. So Badley and Hitch wanted to investigate whether it was decay, so the fact that they just forgot, or whether it was due to interference. And if it was due to interference, then they'd expect to see that those who had played the most games would recall the least amount of teams. And this is exactly what they found. Players who had played the most games forgot the most teams. And this was in proportion to how many games they had played. So they demonstrated that it's interference rather than decay. Because the time interval from because the time interval from start to end of the season was the same, if it had been decay, they would have all been able to recall roughly the same. However, they didn't. Those who had played more forgot more, therefore it had to be due to interference. So this is a real world example of interference. Last task now to hopefully consolidate some of the things that we've learnt today. If participants memorised 10 or more word lists, they remembered about 20% of what they had learned after 24 hours. Which study was this finding from? Write me a name down. Try and not look at your notes. So you should have written Underwood. And which explanation for forgetting did Underwood study support? And you should have written proactive interference, because the past learning of the word lists interfered with new learning of the word lists. Performance was worse if participants had been given an intervening task between initial learning and recall. Which study was this finding from? You should have put Muller and Pilzecker. And which explanation for forgetting did Muller and Pilzecker study support? For this, you should have written retroactive interference, because their recently learnt knowledge of describing the three landscapes interfered with the learning for the nonsense syllables. So as always, please upload onto Teams and let me know if there are any questions, and I'll see you soon.